So today we're going to be talking with two highly accomplished Yale women who have dedicated their careers in service to our country. U.S. Department of Defense's Katie Rivkin will be talking with recently sworn in U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Ann Witkowsky. Ann was recently sworn in as the U.S. Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. She has served the nation in a variety of capacities, starting as a presidential management intern in 1988, with subsequent roles at the White House National Security Council, the U.S. Department of State, and the Department of Defense. She holds a BA in Russian and East European Studies from Yale, and an MPA with a concentration in international security from that other school in Boston, I forget, Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. She's a recipient of the State Department Superior and Meritorious Honor Awards, the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Civilian Service, and the Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. Really excited to be with you. Also joining us, Katie Rivkin Visser. She's served as Special Counsel to the General Counsel of the U.S. Department of State since 2015. She previously worked as a litigation associate in the New York office of Davis, Polk, and Wardwell, and served as a law clerk in the Southern District of New York and in The Hague. Hague. She earned degrees from Yale, University of Oxford, and Yale Law School. She's a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations and is a security fellow with the Truman National Security Project. So, we're thrilled Ann and Katie are here with us today, and they're here primarily to talk about their personal careers and in their personal capacities, and nothing they say represents the official views of the U.S. government, the Department of State, or the Department of Defense. So, welcome, and thank you for joining us. I think I will turn it over to the two of you. Katie, if you want to kind of drive for a few moments, and that would be fantastic.
Sure. Thank you so much, Corinne, for the introduction, and thank you for having me and inviting me to participate tonight. I'm so excited to be here in celebration of Women's History Month for a discussion about careers in government with this wonderful Yale, if virtual, community, and with a truly exceptional public servant in Assistant Secretary Witkowsky. Now, I've actually been lucky to know Ann for a number of years. When I started my own career in government service and joined the Defense Department in 2015 as a lawyer, Ann was serving as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Stability and Humanitarian Affairs, and she was actually one of my first clients. And so we worked together while she was in that role, and I've benefited from her friendship and guidance in the years since. And I'm really grateful that all of you who've joined us tonight are now also going to be able to benefit from hearing her thoughts and stories and all her wisdom. And so, Ann, if you're ready, I'll jump right into some questions.
That sounds great, Katie.
So maybe to start, if you could briefly walk us through your career trajectory, maybe focusing on some key decision points along the way. And maybe as one of your earliest decision points, since we're among the Yale community, was this the kind of work you had planned or the goal that you had when you were in college at Yale?
Well, thank you. And before I answer your question, if I might also give my thanks to being here tonight with the Yale Club in celebration of Women's History Month. Thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be here among Yale graduates, are an extraordinary group. There are so many incredible Yale graduates, Katie, back at you, who are in public service, and incredible women in public service. So thank you all for having me. And I have to shout out, I see at least one really great friend on the screen, Sophia, a classmate, Ed, Sevilla, and my neighbor, Reed. And so thank you all for coming and joining us. And Katie, I just have to say about you that I was so thrilled to know that you would be doing the interview tonight. You were really extraordinary from the very start. When you began at the Pentagon, you gave us fabulous, fabulous legal advice on some really complicated issues. And I'm still looking for a way to work with you again. So I wanted to get that out of the way. I also want to say that I was really happy to have the opportunity to be interviewed about my career trajectory tonight, because I had no idea what I wanted to do when I was in college. And I really wish I'd had the benefit of hearing from Yale alumni and alumnae to help me out, to give me some guidance, to hear my thoughts. And maybe that's why I do spend a lot of time with younger people now. So I hope that if someone later on has a chance to listen to what I have to say, it will be of some use. And the second reason is that I find public service incredibly satisfying, and I believe in it, and I hope I can illuminate that a little bit for the audience. Okay, so now, Katie, would you like me to answer your question? Well, I wish I could tell you I'd had a plan, as I said, but that was completely untrue when I was in college. I did have a very influential experience when I was there, and that was an opportunity to study in the Soviet Union in Leningrad in 1981. Yale did have a fabulous Russian studies program. Maybe some of you on the line took Russian when you were at Yale. And I had the opportunity to study in Leningrad during the Cold War, which gave me the chance to experience both the richness of Russian culture, art, and the people, and the deprivation of human rights, freedom of speech, and life under authoritarian rule. And that was a fairly shocking experience coming from Yale. And it took me a long time, I think, to process it, and really was influential in my choices later on. So flash forward to graduate school, where I was studying at that other place, and with getting a master's degree in public administration with a concentration in international security. And from there, when I was graduating, I had the opportunity to be part of a program called the Presidential Management Intern Program, which has already been mentioned. It's a feeder program from graduate schools that gives one an opportunity to spend a couple of years doing rotations in one's home agency and then around to other places. And I was fortunate enough to be selected for a PMI position in the Pentagon, which I don't think had probably ever entered my mind when I was in college. That's going to be a theme through this discussion, just following my best instinct, but not with a particular plan. I knew that I wanted by that time to work on arms control issues. I don't think I ever thought I would have the opportunity to really meaningfully participate in those kinds of conversations. But then I found through this position in the Pentagon that I did have that opportunity. And I worked on different multilateral negotiations, rotating within the Pentagon to work on negotiations that were taking place at that time in Vienna on conventional arms control and confidence building measures. Very, very important work at the tail end of the Cold War, and that continued through the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. I had the opportunity through that internship also to rotate over to the State Department and to, in both places, work with some extraordinary people, many of whom, at least in the State Department, went on to become ambassadors, and some of whom I'm still working with today. So those foundational relationships were incredibly, incredibly important. And when I came back to the Pentagon, I found my way to a position there permanently. It wasn't for very long, but it was a full-time position working on European security negotiations with the most extraordinary group of people. And Katie, I know you know what this is about. Really amazing civilians, our uniformed military, and others who really make the days there, I think, incredibly meaningful, as hard as we know that they can be. I think the teamwork there I found at the Pentagon was really important. So that was a very important choice that I made, this foundational early decision to go to the Pentagon once I was selected for the program. And then I'll just mention one other, and then I'll fast forward because I've had a long career. But while I was serving at the Pentagon, I started in the Reagan administration. We transitioned to the Bush administration. While I was serving at the Pentagon, Bush lost the election and President Clinton won. And things got pretty quiet, as they tend to do during the transition period. And one day I got a phone call from the White House transition office. I'd be given a little heads up from a friend of mine that I might get this phone call. I was pretty much minding my own business. And this person said, would you be interested in a position in the White House on the National Security Council staff? And that was a scary question at the time. But of course I said, sure. And they asked me for a resume, and I didn't really have one because I wasn't thinking about going anywhere. So I quickly went in one Saturday and I typed something up and I faxed it. I faxed it over to the personnel office. And one thing led to another, and then I had an interview. And then the next thing I knew, I was sitting in the West Wing of the White House, and I was completely terrified. And then I was in the National Security Advisor's office in Tony Lake's office, and I was interviewing with him. And I guess I was not so terrified that I was able to answer the questions. And he hired me and he brought me onto the NSC staff. And as Katie knows, and some of you also who perhaps are on who served in government, the NSC staff turns over almost completely the National Security Council staff from administration to administration. So I came in as one of the young, new professionals on the Clinton NSC staff, and I ended up staying there almost 8 years on detail from the Department of Defense. It was a seminal experience. So that was a second really important inflection point in my career. And then one final thing I'll just say about my life, because the choice that I made at the end of my time at the NSC staff is very important to the theme of my career. I got married while I was on the NSC staff and became pregnant with our first child, and took maternity leave and came back and finished up some important work there on arms control. We were concluding an arms control agreement with the states of the former Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. We can come back to questions about that if anyone is interested. But I finished that work, and then I decided to leave government because I wanted to be in a position that allowed me more flexibility to be with our son. And that's when I went to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. The rest of the pattern is shows me in a variety of places, and we can come back to some questions on that as well. I re-entered government in the Obama administration in a political position in the Counterterrorism Bureau, and then I moved back to the Defense Department also in a political position where I met Katie. I left government at the end of the Obama administration, and now have the incredible honor to be serving in the Biden administration, having been sworn in early January.
Question that I'm going to ask a couple questions up front, but we're leaving some time at the end for Q&As from the rest of the folks out there. So as we're going along, make sure that you're noting down your questions, and Corinne will make sure that we have some time for all of those at the end. But Anne, I want to go back to something that you were just saying, which is the time you spent in government and then you kind of left and went to CSIS and have kind of come back and jumped in and out. Are there anything, you mentioned kind of the people who you loved working with, you mentioned the teamwork. Are there any other aspects of working in government and working in public service that have made you feel like you want to keep coming back and serving in these roles?
Right, Katie, I think that's a really good question, because we know that government features long hours, people who have choices, maybe someone like yourself, an attorney, can make more money in a different, in a different setting. And we work in very large places where sometimes it seems really, really hard to get things done. So I would say there are three things in all, and you mentioned two of them. One, the people. Two, the teamwork, the satisfaction of working together with a team on really, really hard problems and being successful. And third, the mission, being part of something that is larger than oneself. And I'll just take one example. Katie, I think you came in at the tail end of this, but our office had the opportunity to work on the response to the 2014 Ebola epidemic in West Africa. And for those of you who may not know, when the epidemic was raging and got really bad, President Obama decided that the United States would take a leadership role and seek to bend the curve of the epidemic in West Africa. And specifically, we were very focused on Liberia. And in order to do that, we deployed almost 3,000 troops to the region to build Ebola treatment units, to put in place laboratory testing capability, to train healthcare workers. It was really an extraordinary experience. They were there until their civilians were in a position to come back into the country. It was safe, and the infrastructure was better placed to serve them, including an important hospital that the Department of Defense put into place. But I have to say, Katie, I felt like we literally saved lives in that, and I was a small part of a much larger group working on that problem set, from our embassy to our military officers, to the United Nations with Samantha Power at the helm, to the White House, the State Department, and what we were doing in OSD policy. And I think experiences like that really keep me coming back, because sometimes the days are extremely hard, let's face it, because the problems are hard. So I relish these successes. Well, how about you, Katie? What keeps you in government?
I think, no, it's so great to hear. I think many of the same kinds of kind of values, and you're right that the hours can be very long, but I think the mission-driven work is just really exceptional. I loved the time that I spent at a law firm. Davis Polk was a great place to work. I worked with incredibly smart lawyers. I learned a lot while I was there. But I think while I was there, I was really just itching to work on some of the issues in the world that I really cared about. And I think something that's really special about being a lawyer in government in particular is that, your clients aren't only people like you, like Anne, when she was the Deputy Assistant Secretary, other folks in government, the Secretary of Defense is ultimately our client at DoD, but you're also working on behalf of the United States. The Constitution in the United States is your client. And so you're thinking about how your decisions really impact the country and the way that the country is viewed in the world when you're working in the international space. So it's been incredibly meaningful and incredibly valuable for me too. You mentioned kind of working across a number of different presidential administrations, and you spent some time in government as a career government worker, just as I am, and also as a political appointee. And so I wanted to ask a quick question about kind of what it has been like for you working across different presidential administrations, and kind of what the differences have been in your role as a civil servant career government employee versus as a political appointee.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I have to mention that this is the 5th president I've worked under, which does make me feel a little old. I started in the Reagan administration. And as Katie said, I was career through Reagan, Bush, and then the Clinton years, and then have since then come back in political positions. I think what's important for people to know about, first of all, serving across different administrations is that there's a lot of work that carries over from one administration to another, right, Katie? And people don't necessarily see that. Even between administrations that one thinks of as quite different, let's say from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. And so there is a lot of continuity to our work to our national security. So that's what's the same. Second, in terms of being career and political, I would say both roles can be equally frustrating and equally satisfying. It just depends, right, on the work and the circumstances. In a political role, the one thing I would say that feels different than being in a career role, well, I would say 2 points. First of all, there is a significant sense of responsibility to a particular presidency. And a president's agenda. And in my case now, in my current role, which is a confirmed role, of course, I was nominated by the president, and I feel that that sense of responsibility in a different way than I would have felt in a career position. And then second, I would say, I feel that there is a sense of urgency about my work. And that's because each presidential term is a relatively short amount of time to serve and to make the kind of positive and lasting change that one hopes for. So those are two really key differences. I still feel the same sense of responsibility to the people who are in the institutions where I'm working, and for me now in the State Department, to care for them, to mentor them, and in the case of the Biden administration, to advance a particular agenda, which is to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in the Department of State, something that this secretary has made a real priority.
You just mentioned kind of some of the work that you're currently doing in your role, mentoring some of the younger folks at state and in your office. But I wonder who have been some of your greatest mentors, and do you have any advice for young professionals, for any students who may be listening, on how to foster those kinds of relationships as you move forward, or as anyone moves forward in a career?
Yeah, that's also a great question. And I'm really curious. I'm going to turn this back. I'm preparing you, Kate. I'm going to turn it right back over to you when I'm done. So just to get a sense of perspective, when I entered the Pentagon, it was a culturally a very different time than now, in the way that work was rewarded or commented upon. So basically, if one was doing a good job, one just got more work to do. So it was hard to develop mentors in that setting. And also there were not really very many women. There were a couple of other women who had been there when I arrived in the Pentagon, and they were in supervisory positions, but not terribly senior advisory positions. Although I would say those women, and one of them in particular, was very, very important to me because she was one of the few women in the Pentagon. But by and large, I didn't have mentors. I don't think we understood. I just have to say, we didn't understand what it meant to have a mentor. And so instead, as a substitute, I spent my time watching people I worked for and worked with and who worked for me. And I tried to take a best of what they had to offer. And if it was possible, to adopt some of those traits and try not to do what I observed to be mistakes, which is not a substitute for training and not a substitute for having mentors. What can I say? Of course, along the way, I had role models. And here I think it's worth pausing to remember Madeleine Albright, who was an incredible role model to women in the field of national security, was so supportive, was so dedicated to democracy and freedom and prevention of atrocities. And a lot of the values that we are pursuing in our work, you've been pursuing in your work, Katie, in so many ways, and so have I, but really not mentors. What I would say to younger people about mentors, because we now know how to mentor, and because we didn't have mentors, we find it very important to mentor, is that to anyone who's young, who's listening, or earlier in their career, who's making a career change, don't be afraid to reach out. When you do, use your mentor's time wisely, do your homework before you reach out to your mentor. And by all means, stay in touch so that when you do need something, a recommendation, a phone call, or whatever it is, which I'm always happy to provide, you don't need to feel awkward about reaching back out, right? And being in touch. But Katie, what's been your experience? You've come in so many years after me. Is it different now?
I think that there are some things that are different. I think that there are some really exceptional kind of networks, mostly, frankly, outside of government and outside of the department, I think, but that are really fostering a lot of a sense of community and an ability to kind of meet other people who are the kinds of people who you mentioned, who are your role models and the people who you want to, whose careers you want to emulate. I think that there is absolutely more of a sense now in government, when you're working with folks, that developing a relationship can be a relationship that continues. So even when political appointees leave, people are very happy and open to kind of be available and reach out. I think the one thing that took a little bit of time for me to feel comfortable with was reaching out to people who I didn't know and who I didn't work with. You know, I have felt very comfortable reaching out to you over the years after we worked together for such a long time. But I think that one of the incredible things for me has been recognizing the willingness of people to answer an email or answer a phone call, even when you don't know them that well. You know, I owe this job that I'm currently in part to a professor of mine in law school who I didn't know very well in law school at all. But when I was thinking of transitioning into government, I reached out to her and said, you know, these are the kinds of things I'm interested in. She, at the time, was on a leave of absence, spending some time at the Pentagon in a special counsel role in the general counsel's office. And I said, can you tell me about what the general counsel's office at DOD does? And we talked for a long time about the kinds of things I wanted to work on. And she said, you know, there's a job opening in this office soon. You know, let's keep talking. And if you're interested, you know, maybe I can pass your resume along. And it was, you know, getting over the initial fear of reaching out to someone you don't know well. But things like that, I think, can open a lot of doors. And it takes a little bit of practice, I think, even for me still, but those can be really worthwhile relationships to open up, as well as kind of develop with mentors you do know.
I think that's great advice.
And in thinking of advice, is there any other advice, maybe before we open it up to some other questions from the audience, thinking and looking back, is there any advice that you would have given to your younger self? And maybe any specific advice, since this is Women's History Month, that you might give to women who are considering careers in government and public service right now?
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I'd have given myself a lot of advice. I don't know if I'd listened to myself, but I would have given myself a lot of. There are a lot of things I should have known. I would have said to myself, trust your instincts. I think it just took me a really long time to learn to trust my instincts, to be more confident, especially in the realm of national security, which can be a pretty tough environment. Be more confident. I would have said to myself, don't take your mistakes quite so hard, learn from them and move on. And what I do tell younger people is make the little mistakes so you don't make the big ones. Mistakes are important along the way. And then I would have said, be comfortable knowing that there is no one size fits all way to serve. It can be very confusing looking around and seeing the different ways, the different pathways that our peers are on or people we work for are on, but there's really no one particular trajectory, and everyone's circumstances in terms of their professional goals and maybe in terms of their imperatives at home can be quite different. For women, I would just briefly say, I think it's a great time for women to enter into government. There's a real commitment to advancing women in national security. I think that's been true for a time on and off. It's very true of this administration. And I think I would also say, again here, Katie, I would ask you to comment that despite the fact that I did mention I stepped off the government track for family reasons, and I mentioned one instance and I stepped back in later years again, once we had a second child, I do think that there are lots of places in government that are conducive to work-life balance. It's possible to find them. I don't know if you agree with me, but I think that is one potentially attractive feature for women working in government. And I don't want to put this all on women, but women as the bearer of children, women sometimes as the primary caregivers for aging parents. I think this is an issue that women do tend to think a little bit more about than men.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think you're right very much in saying that there are many different ways to work in government, and there are many different ways to serve in ways that work for you and for your family. I think particularly, frankly, during the pandemic, the government adapted in ways that I don't think we even thought was possible, that there are new telework kinds of opportunities, even when you're working on secure kinds of communications sometimes. And so I think that maybe even after these couple years, there's even more flexibility than before. And I think the only other thing that I might add to what you said, and I was thinking about something you said earlier, which is when, there weren't that many other women when you joined government in the national security space. I think it's remarkable kind of, having been in government in the kind of early mid stages of my career, how many women I have been able to work with in government, and particularly in these national security spaces. But I think the one thing that I would think is that there's still a long way to go, and there's still many, many times when I am the only woman in a room, or at DoD the only civilian in a room. Everyone else is either in uniform or a retired uniformed person. And I think just having confidence, as you said, and not being afraid to enter some of those positions when there may not be someone who has your background, that there is space for people, even when everyone around you doesn't look like you or doesn't have the same experience as you. And so I think that that's been something that's been and I think you're right that there's a lot of development now and in this administration to try to make some of those rooms look a lot more like a lot more people in the country.
I have a question. Actually, I have a couple of questions, but one, one thing you mentioned, Anne, that really struck me is about sort of getting things done in a complicated environment. And I would ask each of you, because I mean, I think of, when I think of complicated organizations, nothing's more complicated than government, right? What kind of tips, tricks, advice do you have for getting things done effectively in complex organizations?
Wow. Well, I'll mention a couple things. I'll kick it off, and maybe Katie, you'll jump in, and then I'll be inspired to other ideas. I think the first point may seem kind of obvious, but it's important to keep front of mind that as in any environment, relationships are so important. Trust is the coin of the realm, especially when one is working across agency lines, or sometimes even within agencies where a point of view might not be shared across, in my case, across, say, bureaus in the Department of State, and being able to sit down with someone and really nug through a problem, that is incredibly important. Then to build allies toward a common objective. I think in a lot of ways I put that at the top of my list. And I will say that COVID has made this a little more difficult. I think, being in person matters when one is trying to work through a really tough problem and get to agreement. I think the second feature that I would mention is that one can get a lot of things done in government if one doesn't want to take credit. Let it be somebody else's idea. And you'd be amazed at how much can get done. To get buy-in from other people, and and let them shine, and it feels pretty good. So, Katie, those are my 2 points. What do you think?
I agree wholeheartedly, and maybe would just kind of refine one of them too, which is kind of not necessarily needing to be the one to take credit, and being open when you don't know the answer, and when there are other people who can help fill in gaps. This goes along with what Anne was saying about building allies and building trust. But there is rarely a question that comes through me. I mean, oftentimes the questions that we get asked need to be answered in no time at all. And I rarely ever work on anything alone. So I'm always reaching out to other people who have expertise. One of the great things about working in government, even though it can be a bureaucratic nightmare, is that there are people who have incredible institutional memory, and people who are just exceptionally smart and have deep, deep knowledge on some of these issues. And so just knowing how to find those people and not being afraid or not being embarrassed to ask questions or say when you don't know something can really help make you a more efficient worker.
Jeff, would you like to ask a question?
I would. So, first, I'm really just blown away by the discussion tonight and the guests. So thanks so much for coming and sharing everything. We hear all the time announcements and people have been nominated for positions, and you see their Yale's doing things, and you have a sense of pride, but there's a distance. So having you here live means so much. I think, at least to me, I'm sure to all of us. So thank you. And I had two questions. One, I'm probably going to wait a little while because it was a little bit off topic, but I'd like to get your views on something. But the on topic is that Yale-ness. Where have you found the threads of what you had gotten, when you were in New Haven and your growth at Yale, and how it's filtered through how you operate, the differences or similarities with other folks coming from other places. What has sort of the Yale thread done for you?
Wow. I'll start.
I could ask my other question. It might be easier.
No, yeah. Well, I've given this a lot of thought, and I'm not sure I even before the event I have all the answers. But I'll say a couple of things about that. Well, one I already mentioned, which was the experience of studying in the Soviet Union, which just had a profound effect on me, and which fostered a certain confusion for a while about what I could do with that experience. But at the end of the day, it was so foundational to my career, and certainly relevant at the moment, right? Second, I would say a thread of understanding what excellence really means, to really produce a fine quality product. I attribute my understanding of that to being at Yale. Sometimes my understanding of that at Yale was because I worked really hard and I didn't necessarily produce a really fine product. And maybe that's a little bit of why I like being in government, because I can share my products with other people now, and they can make them much better. And then third, I would say a thread is about the incredibly varied backgrounds of my classmates at Yale, and just being in an environment with lots of people with incredibly rich backgrounds, even in college, people who are really passionate and committed to what they do. And I think some element of that now I found again in various places as I've been working in government. I will say, even though this is being recorded, that when I went to Yale, it was a little confusing time for women. I wasn't by any stretch in the first class of women, but the culture at Yale was in the process of changing. And I think it's taken me a long time to be able to understand what that experience meant to me, because I was there at that particular time. Katie?
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of what I still kind of take and look back at Yale is the sense of community. I think having the residential college community as a TD, and all of the various other kinds of communities throughout the university. I also played field hockey, and so that also taught me a lot about time management. But I think that kind of knowing that you're kind of surrounded by people who are all just exceptional people and are all just so smart in different ways and have different kinds of experiences and different kinds of understanding. And they're all there with you to learn from in the same way that you hope that you are contributing. And I think that kind of ethos has not only inspired kind of public service, but also the ways in which you navigate big spaces like the government or like the Defense Department, is kind of finding your residential college, right? Like finding your community within the larger whole.
That's great. I'm going to try to go in order. So if I go out of order accidentally, it's because of oversight. But Eleanor, did you have a question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm a prospective global affairs and economics major, and I'm trying to refine which route I want to go and have a little bit of time to explore and figuring it out. But with both of your different capacities, one continuing on to an MPA and another with your Juris Doctorate, even though it was only a step in your journey, what does that specific degree, or what did it bring to the table to you? What does it contribute to your career today?
Well, that's a very good question. So in my case, it was the getting the MPA was the précis, the necessary precondition to entering government, because the program that took me into government, the Presidential Management Intern program, takes master's degree graduates. So in that sense, it was very important. It also helped me fill in a lot of gaps that I had coming out of college, because I'd really focused on language and literature and history, and I'd left behind economics and statistics and management. And then I was able to explore all of that in graduate school. I will say, as you're thinking about your next steps, I did take a few years after college before I went to graduate school. And it seemed like I felt so old when I finally went to graduate school 3 years after I finished college. But I would definitely advise taking a break. It can be very helpful. Katie?
Yeah, I mean, I think the JD for me, I was a history major when I was at Yale, and kind of fell into that major, not just because I was looking through the course book when it used to be the big fat, blue book that you would scroll through and try to highlight and find your courses. They were.
Is it like a website now, or what is it?
I think so.
Oh yeah, there's so many. There are like 6 different websites to try and figure out what you want to do.
But when I was looking through, all the classes I wanted to take were history classes. And so I figured that's a great way to choose my major. So when I went to law school, for me, it was a ton of skill building. Law school kind of teaches you new ways to think, new ways to write, new ways to research, ways to communicate, that have been, I think, whether or not I decided to actually practice as a lawyer, which I love doing, but I have many friends who were in law school who chose not to actually practice law in their careers. I think those skills, and whatever skills you might develop in whichever program you pursue, are the kinds of things that will kind of carry you through the rest of your career. It's really, I think grad school is such a great place to kind of build a lot of those foundations that will then serve you throughout the rest of your career, no matter which doors open, because you may very well end up someplace that you don't expect.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yes. Ed, did you have a question?
Sure, absolutely. Katie and Anna, I want to thank you so much. And I'm a classmate of Ann's, and we're just so thrilled to have you here. I want to ask a question about civilian military connections, but I want to set a little bit of context to it. Because for work, I am at the USS Constitution Museum. You see the picture behind me. And you both spoke about sort of women working as women in the Pentagon. I bring me greetings from the museum, greetings from the 77th Commander of Constitution, B.J. Farrell, who's the first woman to command Constitution in the 224-year history of the ship. So you sort of see time change happening a little bit slowly. But in my work, I've come to understand a little bit more about military careers. And I wanted to ask both of your senior Defense Department officials, what did you know of the military when you were at Yale? And what do you think about the military now, as you are both kind of working in complex military organizations to, make good things happen in the world?
Katie, you want to start? Or do you want me to start?
Whichever you'd prefer, Anne.
Okay. Why don't you go first this time, and then I'll.
So I will be frank, I did not know much about the military when I came in to the Defense Department. I am a civilian. I hadn't interned in any, in a JAG's office. The work that I had done at the Yugoslavia War Crimes Tribunal before coming in to the Pentagon was probably the closest that I had been in working kind of with military experts when we were trying to kind of work on some cases that involved some really particular types of munitions or particular ways in which military operations were implemented. And so I was kind of starting to learn a little bit of the vocabulary. But there was a really steep learning curve for me when I came in. And I think that there was also a steep learning curve in gaining credibility in some ways, working in a military environment, coming in, frankly, as an Ivy League educated civilian. It was very different from a lot of the other lawyers who are in my office, many of whom are retired JAGs, who kind of had a full career in the services and then retired out and kind of serve the rest of their civilian careers in our office, in the general counsel's office. And I think I had some humility, and I listened a lot, and I was also just very lucky to have a couple colleagues in my office who really took me under their wing. I didn't necessarily agree with everything that they might think. I think I came with a slightly different perspective, but it made for, I think, even better work product, because I would bring my own perspective and they would bring their many years of military experience to any particular questions. And, I think in my mind, I kind of came into this role after having worked at one of the war crimes tribunals thinking, well, wouldn't it be great to be a lawyer, in the general's ear telling them, oh no, please don't commit war crimes, instead of trying to look at things after the fact and trying to assess whether or not war crimes had been committed. And I think that I didn't think that jobs like that existed for people like me. And I'm really grateful that I found kind of an office where I have been able to do that kind of work. But it hasn't always been easy. And I think that it has only clarified in my mind that, the war making component of US government power is sobering and can be very difficult to work in every now and then, but can also be incredibly meaningful and incredibly powerful. And as Anne was saying, having the resources of the US military to help implement not only military programs, but other kinds of programs throughout the US government, which is a huge part of the work of the department, has been incredibly meaningful. So I've been both surprised and just really grateful to be able to be part of the community, I think.
That's such a wonderful answer, Katie. And Ed, it is so wonderful to see you, and you look just the same. So thanks, and thanks for asking the question. So it's interesting to listen to what Katie had to say, because so much of what you had to say, Katie, resonates in my own experience, which was so many years before. I started so many years before you entered the government. So, Ed, I'm sure, I think I'm right, but ROTC was still banned on campus. Is that?
Yes, that's right.
Yes,
that's
when
right.
we went to school. And so, I grew up in high school years during the Vietnam era, and then ROTC being banned on campus, and really had no exposure. My own father did serve in World War II, but that seemed very far away. And so I really didn't have a lot of exposure either. And I graduated from college, I worked for a few years, and then made my way to graduate school. And interestingly enough, Katie, I had a similar calculus to the one that you had when I decided to work in the Pentagon, because I was really interested in arms control. Yeah, it's hard to remember, but in that time, in the 80s, we were concerned about the threat of nuclear war. And though I didn't end up working on nuclear arms control, I ended up working on conventional multilateral arms control. I had that as a motivating factor. And I thought, well, if I have an opportunity to work in the Pentagon and really understand how defense policy is made, why these weapon systems are important, and might have an opportunity then to influence the outcomes of these negotiations from that standpoint, what an amazing experience it would be. And then so that was my calculus. But then after I entered the Pentagon, I was surprised at first and really pleased by the experience that I had there. And as Katie indicated, this isn't universal, but I too had military officers who, just extended that sense of teamwork to me. There were other experiences too, but having that was so vital and important, especially as a young person and as a young woman. And so that was important. And then third, to your point, Ed, about civil military relations, Katie too, and I was in the part of the Pentagon that is civilian controlled. I mean, it is the representation, the heart of civilian control of the military, and that's a very powerful concept that the U.S. government has held dear. And I think it's so very important. And one really in that position gets a sense of I don't want to overstate this, but the importance of the mission and the difficulty of the issues that one is working on, and at the same time the incredible capabilities that our military brings to the table, and that relationship that is embodied in civilian control of the military, where guidance that is written by civilians, signed off on by the civilian Secretary of Defense, is then acted upon by the uniformed military.
Elaine, I saw that you had a question in the chat. Do you want to?
Yeah, I simply wanted to ask, I know it's not in relation to what we've discussed so far, but just the role of women in cybersecurity in government. I know it tends to be a strongly male cadre, and I just wondered if you had any experience with that and what your thoughts are in terms of the needs right now and the number of women currently involved.
Katie, are you working in cybersecurity these days?
I'm kind of tangentially working on some cybersecurity related work. I think that you're right that the number of women in that field, in government and outside of government, I think is still growing. But I think that there are so many opportunities. Cybersecurity is really a next and current frontier of where these big national security questions and the mode where a lot of the national security related work is happening these days. And so I think that there are many opportunities, not just in the federal government too, but this goes back a little bit to what I was saying before. I think there are many different ways to do this kind of cybersecurity work in government. There is cybersecurity kind of protective work that you can do at any of the departments and agencies. There's legal work certainly that you can do in the cyber realm. There are at any of the intelligence agencies, there's a ton of cyber work happening. But also don't forget, kind of in thinking about public service beyond the federal government, there's so much cybersecurity work that needs to happen in local governments and in state governments, protecting critical infrastructure. All of that kind of work just opens up a lot of different avenues for many, many different ways that people can contribute in that field these days, I think.
And actually something you said, Katie, reminds me that the State Department is on the verge of establishing a new bureau, which will focus on, it will have a cybersecurity component to it. It may not be exclusively focused on cybersecurity, but what's interesting, I think, about the direction that the field is taking is that there is going to be, looking forward, a more robust diplomatic component as we think about how to maintain democratic principles in digital, I'd say in the digital environment and the digital world, and that can manifest those policy streams can manifest in lots of different ways. They can be about export controls. They can be about sanctions. They can be about norms and principles that need to be negotiated. I think there's so much interesting and new work that needs to be done here. And I would say on the policy side, at least on the outside, I do know quite a few women who are at the forefront of the field right now. And I think that will continue to be the case as the field grows and matures in government and probably outside it as well.
And I think that's such a good point. If I could just add one other point, I think that one of the really interesting things about the cyber realm right now is that it's a domain where, as Anne said, there's so much kind of developing within the cyber world that having skills and knowledge in other areas is going to become incredibly relevant in how those areas work in the cyber domain. And so, just because you haven't done work in cybersecurity in particular before doesn't mean that the skills and knowledge that you have won't be incredibly important in those jobs and in those areas moving forward. Because as Anne said, a lot of the work these days is trying to figure out how norms, rules, principles, laws that apply in other areas then can be applied in cyberspace.
There's a super interesting question in the chat that I would love to hear your thoughts on. Jeff, did you have something that you wanted to ask them before we?
Well, I did. It's a little related. Let's get to Stephen's point, but it would do again. What a tremendous hour! Probably need another hour or more. I was going to ask, Anne, in particular, with your background with the Soviet Union and so forth, what's going on today. Katie may have insights as well. I've always just wondered if there had been a Marshall Plan, back in the end of the first Bush administration into the Clinton administration, we might have avoided some of this. It's just something always been on my mind. So if there's either a quick answer or who invited him to this party, maybe we could do it offline. Then we can go to Stephen's question and close out.
A Marshall Plan for Ukraine?
Just where the Soviet Union fell, massive resources could have had a different outcome for the next 20, 25 years.
Yeah, I think, boy, you should do a separate hour on that. I think there, it would be really interesting to talk about how our economic policies at the time did or did not influence, where we've gotten to today, in our efforts I wasn't part of this, but our efforts to create in Russia and to influence Russia to a free market economy. I do know that, I was part of the group through arms control and competence building measure negotiations that was working really hard to give Russia confidence that in the peaceful intentions of NATO, even as NATO enlarged. And I think there was a belief at the time, and I don't think it was misplaced, in the concept of what we called a Europe whole and free. That's a little different than your question about a Marshall Plan, but about this idea that Europe could be full of integrated democracy. So I think historians, and I'm sure there's some distinguished historians on the call, will have a rich literature to analyze and to consider as we even as the current events continue to unfold. It looks like do we want to take this last question?
Yeah, are you guys available to stay a couple minutes over, people? Okay, great. Stephen, do you want to ask your question? I don't want to misrepresent it because it looks really.
I don't want to take up everyone's time. So if you can read it, it's pretty long. Probably faster to read it than for me to. But I can give you like a quick condensed version. So basically, defense takes in so many inputs, right? It's a psychology of Putin, history of the Moscow, the whole 1,000-year history of Russia, demographics of Russia, military, economics, just so many inputs, even into technology, right? Let's say, what kind of drones, that the DJI drone that Ukrainians use. Just so many different areas. I'm just curious, the DoD have any initiative to, let's say, democratize or let's say crowdsource information gathering and policy recommendation? Because nowadays you see on Twitter, right, so many people, they have the expertise, right? So someone is really knows, psychology of Putin. Someone really knows the history of Russia. Someone really knows, the drones. Given that we are all limited human beings, we can only be expert in one area, right? So just curious, what's the best mechanism to taking inputs from so many different areas? Some of them are publicly available on Twitter. I'm just curious, does the DoD have any ideas on how to do the crowdsourcing on defense issues? Just thank you so much, and Katie, thank you so much.
Wow, I think that's a really great question. I'm going to take it a little bit to the side and base it on some work that I'm doing now in the Department of State. where I'm really much more focused on longer term building resilience in fragile states, in preventing conflict, and in promoting stability. Then at the end, I'll remind myself, I'll say something about the Ukraine conflict, however. In this undertaking, which now I'm at the front end of, right, because I've just taken the position, I am charged with implementing a law called the Global Fragility Act. And the really interesting thing about that law is it takes a lot of lessons that we've learned the hard way in Iraq and in Afghanistan about the way that the United States interacts with countries where it is seeking, we are seeking to promote stability or to prevent conflict. And it charges us with working in a manner that is much more in partnership with those countries. And to your point, it charges us with developing a plan or plans, long-term plans for engagement in those places in consultation with not only national governments, but also governments at the local or subnational level, and civil society, academics, and the private sector. So to your point about crowdsourcing, or what can we learn from the rich material that's outside and perspectives that are outside of government, I think at least for my part, I'm very much looking forward to taking an approach that maybe is less traditional to the US government, because we're now charged with, in law, looking at what we can learn from those who are outside of government, something that we should have done more, we should have been doing more of, right, for many years. And I think so. I think your question leading to why don't we do this is well placed. In the case of Ukraine, I can't speak to any of the defense related decisions that might be made based on external information, but I do think that there are quite a number of organizations that are going to be crowdsourcing and gathering information, data, and evidence that will help bring Putin and others to justice for the atrocities that are being committed right now. And I think that's a really good use of the kind of information that can be found on the outside, and it's going to be important to gather it and collect it and analyze it and have it at the ready.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you both so much for joining us. This was fascinating. I feel like I've gained 20 IQ points just being in the conversation. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your service. We are, just to do a little housekeeping, we're here every, most Thursdays, if you see it in the newsletter. Next week, we'll be talking Yale Then and Now, and the topic is women in sports. So another Women's History Month topic. So join us if you can, and if you're interested. And thank you again, Katie and Ann. This was just wonderful.